Hey, it's Jake. Welcome back. We're in 2.1 now, where we're going to talk about objects and kind of move away from the abstract and into something a little bit more practical. So everything is an object, first of all, and before we get any more specific about there, we want to be very clear about how objects work in Python. So I wanted to make a separate video just so we can break this down a little bit because we got pretty crazy with it in module 1. So since we know that everything in Python is an object, you might ask yourself, well, what really kind of happens when you type something? So like if I go into an interactive shell, um, let's see, is this not, oh, this is opening my scripts directory. Hang on a second. My app Python. There we go. If you open an interactive shell and you type age equals 42, okay, just that, nothing more than that. Just talking about that. Let's talk about what happens when we do that. So when you create an object like this, it creates an identifier, right, or an ID, which I've told you is not really a value you need to be concerned with. But you need to know that what happens when an object is created. Well, it creates an ID, it creates a type. So even though I didn't tell it that there's a type, it created one automatically, and that type um, could be any number of things. And to know what type of data you're working with, you can just simply enter type, and then for me, I'll enter age here because I set age equal to 42. And let's find out what type age is. This object is the type int. So it automatically assigned this variable the type int because Python was smart enough to see that this was an integer, and so it created an ID and then it created a type and said this is an integer, so I'm going to assign it to a type int. And you'll see it says class int. Don't worry about the class part for now. But just know that it's smart enough to know that if you set a variable to a number, that number will be an integer unless you do something like if I did height, right, equals, and I'm 71 inches tall, but if I put it in quotes, and then I wanted to find the type of height, you'll see that there's a different type, and str stands for string, which is just characters, numbers, letters, whatever, but it's not a number. So it doesn't see this as a number, which means, it's not an integer. So that's what happens when an object is created. So in this case, the name age is placed in the global namespace because I'm not using any sort of function or a class or anything like that. I'm just typing in the interactive shell. So this is going to be created or placed in the global namespace. And if you remember, it goes first the local namespace and then uh, well, we won't get into that. We already went through namespaces. But if you just know that if you do this, just like I did, it's going to go into the global namespace and point to that object. So whenever you're in the global namespace, after you execute this line, we can retrieve that object however we want. So I can retrieve it by using like a print function, and I can retrieve it like this. If I exit out of here, okay, and then I go back in and I say print age, it won't know what that is. So whenever you close this and then you open it again, anything that you create, any object that you create, uh, is removed from the global namespace, and you will have to create it again. So if I type age equals 42, and then I go ahead and print age again, now it knows what it is. So if you're building something and you're getting into it and you're not saving it in a file, just know that if you exit, all that information goes away because it's saving it in your memory on your computer, not on the disk. So that data will just disappear. Um, so if you think about objects, another way to think about it is if you were to move a house, okay, you'd put all of your silverware in a box, right? And you'd probably write kitchen or cutlery on it, right? And objects basically work the same way. So, um, basically, for the rest of this whole section that we go through section two, whenever you read something like name equals some value, whatever the variable declaration is, just think of a place in the namespace that's tied to the scope in which the instruction was written. Okay, so there's like an arrow pointing to the object that has an ID and a type and all that stuff. So um, there's more you can talk about with this, but it's much easier to talk about it using examples once we get some more code. But hopefully that just taking this back just a second, reviewing it and talking about it without all the other complex things, you understand and could answer the question if someone were to ask you what happens when an object is created. Well, it creates an ID and a type and it has a value, right? And unless used other, elsewhere, like this, it's going to be in the global namespace, and that the scope is going to be using that same place because that's where the instruction was written. So if I essentially write age equals 42 in the global scope, then it's going to use the global namespace. If I were to make a function and say age equals 42 inside of that function, because age equals 42 was created inside of that local namespace, then it would be pointing, the scope would be pointing to the local namespace. So let me know if you have any questions, and if not, then we'll move away from objects and start talking about mutability and immutability.